Hello, my name is Natalie Sorrell-Charlesworth, and I'm a PhD student and Associate Lecturer in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. My research explores the relationship between poetry and archives, with particular reference to poetic sequences. Today, we're going to take a look at contemporary poetry. Contemporary means living or occurring at the same time. This is poetry that is happening now and over recent years. It's being created as we go about our lives. It's current, it's modern, but what does it actually look like? What makes a poem contemporary? In this workshop, we're going to take a look at a few examples of poems, and then you'll experiment by creating your own. To begin, let's think about what makes a poem. What are the elements that you might expect to see? How do you know that a piece of writing is a poem instead of a section of prose or an excerpt from a script? Take a moment to pause this video and write down a few examples of elements that you associate with poetry. Restart the video once you have thought of at least 3. Now, let's take a look at some of the elements of poetry and see how many you have managed to think of. First, rhyme. Rhyme, or sound patterning, can come in many different forms. From end-stop rhyme, where the rhyme appears at the end of the line, to internal rhyme, where the sound is echoed inside a line or stanza. We also see other types of sound patterning, the recurring use of certain vowels or consonants, the repeated refrain of words beginning with the letter S, or words consistently starting with the same letter, consonants, sibilants, and alliteration. But then some poems don't rhyme at all. Rhythm. The rhythm or metre of poetry is the pace of the lines in a poem, the rate of stressed or unstressed syllables or words, also known as beats. Metre varies from poem to poem depending on poetic form. Depending on the effect the poet is attempting to create, the metre can be consistent throughout the poem or disrupted. Form. There are many different canonical or traditional forms of poem, such as the sonnet, pantoum, ballad, and so on. Identifiable by various aspects such as metre, rhyme scheme, and the number of lines in a stanza. But even free verse poetry has its own form, its own internal logic. Imagery. A key feature of poetry can be the poet's use of imagery, metaphor or simile, etc., to describe objects or surroundings and convey emotions. Line breaks. In the majority, text will not go all the way across the page from the left to the right margin, unless it's a prose poem, and we'll see an example of that later. Title. A title is just as important as the body of the poem. Poems have a limited amount of space in which to tell a story, capture a moment, or convey a feeling. The space at the beginning of a poem is occupied by a title, and sometimes an epigraph, which is a dedication or citation inserted after the title, but before the rest of the poem begins. These can serve to set the reader in a certain mindset, or give them particular information that could alter their perception of the poem that follows. Did you pick some of these elements? Did you think of any others? Now, let's take a look at some different poems. We'll start with a more traditional poem by the bard himself, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is far from a modern poet. He lived nearly 500 years ago. But a Shakespearean sonnet is a great example of what you might expect a canonical or traditional poem to look like. It has a title, but as a part of a large sequence, this is simply numerical, and so is often known by its opening line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Many Shakespearean phrases are so well known that they have blended into our culture. Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaves hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often in his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and gives life to thee. What form does the poem take? Take a look at it. The rhyme running throughout this poem is an alternate A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D, E-F, E-F rhyme scheme that concludes in a couplet. The rhyme is end-stop throughout. It is 14 lines long, with a turn or volta after the 8th line. These elements indicate that the poem's form is a sonnet. Looking closer at the lines, we find that its metre is that of iambic pentameter, where the beats of are alternately stressed, and there are 5 per line. Shall I compare thee? It's also full of imagery and archaic language, which indicates the time period that it's from. Now you have looked at a more traditional poem, let's move on to some contemporary examples. For each poem, take a moment to look at the elements we talked about earlier. Here's that slide again as a reminder. Now this first poem is by Ian Macmillan, one of the most popular poets of our era. He's got over 50,000 followers on Twitter and appears frequently on radio and TV. Let's take a look. How the Mighty Fell by Ian Macmillan. Let's list great times in history, times that shook the world. Nelson at Trafalgar, or the US flag unfurled at Iwo Jima, or the time a loincloth bloke furled a wheel. Well, none of those historic types can match the way we feel here in Barnsley when we recollect the moment in the sun, when we went to the City of Culture and beat Liverpool 2-1. Let's think about the cliched way this town is often seen. Black caps and rusty Peaky Bird and Arthur Scargill, Yorkshire pudding, Barnsley chop. Here's a new one for your list. When we caught Anfield on the hop, and Brian Howard turned away and the ball sat in the net, on an afternoon that those of us in Barnsley won't forget. Next, pause the video so you can read through and write down how the elements that we've discussed so far appear in this poem. Then restart the video. Also try and write down what you think the poem is about. Is, on the surface, simply a humorous poem about football. The team of Ian's hometown of Barnsley winning a historic victory over Liverpool. But there are undercurrents of a David and Goliath-esque tale. The underdog taking on a top-flight team, class prejudice, the way this town is often seen. You may also have noted that there are several conventional elements recognisable from the previous poem. We have 2 stanzas of regular line length. There is end-stop rhyme throughout the poem in couplets. What else did you see? It may be different from a Shakespearean sonnet, but it is undeniably still a poem. Here's another one. This is What They Did Yesterday Afternoon by Worcestershire. Sections of this poem were shared frequently on social media in the aftermath of the Paris attacks in 2015, although it was written sometime earlier. Shai was born in Kenya to Somali parents and migrated to the UK at the age of 1. In 2013, she was selected as the first young poet of London and her work is popular with celebrities, including Beyoncé. What They Did Yesterday Afternoon by Warsan Shire. They set my aunt's house on fire. I cried the way women on TV do, folding at the middle like a £5 note. I called the boy who used to love me, tried to okay my voice. I said, hello. He said, Warsan, what's wrong? What's happened? I've been praying, and these are what my prayers look like. God, I come from 2 countries. One is thirsty, the other is on fire. Both need water. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the world and whispered, where does it hurt? It hurt. Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. Again, take some time to reread the poem. What does it have in common with the previous pieces? What's different? The shape of the poem is different here. The stanzas and line lengths are no longer regular, and the use of end-stop rhyme has virtually disappeared. Instead, we have internal rhyme and assonance, like the chiming of fire, cried, and 5. The punctuation in this piece is also non-standard. Line breaks are used in the place of commas, and capitalisation is non-standard throughout. But again, it's still a contemporary poem. Our final example for analysis is an excerpt from a longer poem, The House That Jack Built by Jacob Polly. This is from his collection Jack Self, which won the 2016 T.S. Eliot Prize. This one looks a little different. Take some time to pause the video and analyse the poem according to the elements we have discussed so far. The House That Jack Built by Jacob Polly. The first trees were felled and sailed, then slept an age in the northern sun, blackening to iron. Were found by horsemen leading their horses, and raised as clouds' axles, rafters of night, the gods' gates. Were passed through, seen from miles off, rolled the sun and moon along their littles, rooted, put out leaves. For a second time, creaked, tasted rain, held the wind to their hearts, while the horsemen streamed like their horses' manes into the dark. Their fires black smudge in the subsoil, their bridles of gold underground. Lived long, grew great. Were a second time felled, dressed, were sharpened to stakes and raised as a fort by farmers who followed their ploughs to the tree line for fuel. To bake their pots their ashes were buried in, with a scattering of grain. Like stars, each small clay heaven still hangs in the earth. And it goes on. This poem is different again. Like Warsan Shire's poem, the line lengths are not regular, and neither are the stanza lengths. But here, in a very description and imagery-heavy poem, there is also the use of indentation, which is helped to indicate the passing of time. What do you think the poem's about, though? You've only got a section of it here, so you might like to go and have a look. We seem to be talking about wood, but we're also looking at a lot of human history, just for a poem about trees. Here are 2 final examples of very different types of contemporary poems. The first, as I discussed earlier, is a prose poem. Ars Poetica by José Oliveras. Migration is derived from the word migrate, which is a verb defined by Merriam-Webster as to move from one country, place or locality to another. Plot twist. Migration never ends. My parents moved from Jalisco, Mexico, to Chicago in 1987. They were dislocated from Mexico by capitalism, and they arrived in Chicago, and they arrived in Chicago just in time to be dislocated by capitalism. Question: is migration possible if there is no other land to arrive in? My work? To imagine. My family started migrating in 1980 and they never stopped. I was born mid-migration. I've made my home in that motion. Let me try again. I've tried to become American, but America is toxic. I've tried to become Mexican, but Mexico is toxic. Stories I inherited and learned. In other words, just because this is art doesn't mean it is inherently non-violent. My work: to write poems that make my people feel safe, seen, or otherwise loved. My work: to make my enemies feel afraid, angry, or otherwise ignored. My people. My people. My enemies? Capitalism. Susan Sontag. Victims are interested in the representation of their own sufferings. Remix. Survivors are interested in the representation of their own survival. My work? Survival. Question: why poems? Answer: while some of the elements identified earlier have disappeared, noticeably end-stop rhyme and line breaks, the delineating form of stanzas, it is still rich in imagery and sound patterning. It is still, evidently, a poem. Social media has helped drive up a renaissance in poetry in recent decades. One poet who built her career through Instagram is Rupi Kaur, whose sparse, slender poetry then posts on Instagram. To hate is an easy, lazy thing, but to love takes strength. Everyone has, but not all are willing to practice. Rupi Kaur. Now that you've seen some of the many different forms contemporary poetry can take, and this should in no way be considered an exhaustive list, it's time to try and write a poem of your own. Think about which of these poems that you've seen you enjoyed the most. Why did you like them? For the poems you don't like, why did you not like them? On this slide there are 4 prompt words: breakfast, aluminium, circus, and dinosaur. Try and write a poem of any form, on any subject matter, including one of these words. Bonus points if you can write one for each prompt, or a poem that incorporates all 4. It can be funny or serious, it can be a sonnet or free verse. What you write is up to you. Thank you for taking. I hope that you can see that contemporary poetry comes in many forms, from more traditional sonnets to snippets of Twitter poetry. The next slide lists references for all the poems included in this workshop. Why not try out some of the links and explore the